So this is the Johns Plus i100 Pro, an ITX case with 360mm radiator support and compatibility with some of the biggest air coolers on the market. For those of you who are familiar with the case brand Johnsbow, this is their new sub-brand of cases, and the i100 Pro is one of the first cases to be launching under that sub-brand in about 2 months. You can think of this case as kind of like an NR200 XL, quite a bit bigger with larger cooler and GPU support, and made with aluminium and tempered glass. But do we really need that much cooling, and how much better are the thermals compared to an NR200 or an N case? Well, there are a couple of configurations that you can run this case in that I find really interesting, and that I think you guys will be drawn towards if you don't mind the kind of bigger volume. More on that in just a minute. So let's take a look if it's worth picking up. So first off, the Johns Plus i100 Pro is not really that compact. In fact, it's one of the largest ITX cases that I've reviewed. Coming in at 26 liters in volume, it's twice the size of an N-Case M1, so footprint-wise, this is actually going to be fairly comparable to a compact mid-tower, something like an NZXT H510. Having said that, hardware compatibility is pretty respectable, even better than some of those mid-towers. In terms of exterior design and build quality, it's not bad at all. I'd probably rate the i100 Pro about a 7 out of 10 in this regard. We're working with thick aluminium panels with a sandblasted finish, no ugly logos, and the I/O is located at the top, including USB Type-C. The i100 Pro is available with both tempered glass and ventilated side panels, although in terms of ventilation, there's not much at all. So if you're considering this case, I'd highly recommend just getting the TG version instead. Turns out it's also a little bit cheaper. So this is one of those cases where tempered glass actually makes a lot of sense, seeing as it doesn't really impede the intended airflow design of this case. With 3 bottom-mounted 120mm fans pulling fresh air in through the bottom and another 3 pulling air through the top, you get this kind of air tunnel approach, which is really effective. But the real reason I took this case on for review was due to the flexible and roomy interior, which actually has 2 main layout options. The first one, which is how the case ships, is an oversized sandwich layout, and then you have the traditional layout with a horizontally mounted GPU, which in my opinion makes a lot more sense. Both configurations support up to a 360mm liquid cooler up top with a pretty generous 68mm of clearance with both layouts. That means 360mm AIOs will fit no problem at all, and if you're installing a custom loop, you could go as big as a 40mm thick 360mm PE rad from EK. And on the note of custom loops, in the traditional layout, 3 120mm fans can sit directly underneath a 2-slot graphics card, and this means that you can also fit an ultra slim 360mm radiator down there along with some slim fans, pretty much identical how I've got a slim 240mm at the bottom of my N-Case M1. It's almost the exact amount of clearance in terms of height, so a custom loop is definitely something that I have on the menu for this case down the road. But personally, I think this is going to be one of the more popular kind of setups in this case, especially for those group of users who don't want to deal with liquid cooling and pumps and kind of messing around with AIOs. There really isn't much risk there, but I know there are those group of people out there who just prefer the simplicity of air cooling. So this is air cooling in the traditional layout with something nice and big like an NH-D15 from Noctua, and I think this is going to be one of the main specs that gets people interested in this case, because you can't really fit an NH-D15 in many ITX cases out there. And also something really interesting here is that even with a Noctua NH-D15 cooling the CPU, you've still got 65mm and 360mm of clearance here for another radiator or an AIO. So if you wanted to air cool your CPU but then liquid cool your GPU for some reason, it'd be a really odd setup, but it is actually possible in the i100 Pro. GPU support is also the same for both the sandwich and the traditional layout, 3-slot cards up to 373mm in length and 160mm in height. But a really important note, there are only 2 PCI expansion slots here with both layouts, so although the thickness of a 3-slot card will fit here, cards with actually 3 PCI expansion slots like an RTX 3090 FE won't actually fit. So I think that's one of the bigger oversights of this case. Another thing that I would have loved to see with this case to address cooling for larger graphics cards would have been an adjustable motherboard tray, very similar to the Lian Li O11 Mini. That way you'd be able to use a 2.5 slot or maybe even a 3-slot card with full-sized fans underneath. As the case is right now, if you are running a 2.5 slot card, you can can only install a pair of slim fans underneath, and then with 3 slot cards you have to rely solely on the GPU fans, which won't be nearly as effective. As for the sandwich layout, I personally think it's quite oversized and unoptimized for this case, especially when the vented panels don't offer that much ventilation at all. This air cooling layout is the most attractive to me and probably what I'd recommend for most of you. Just the sheer amount of volume that you can move through this case with 6 120mm fans and an NH-D15 is really substantial. In terms of CPU thermals, we're about 5 degrees better compared to the air cooling that we can achieve in the NR200, although to be fair, at a slightly higher noise level and case volume. There's no hiding the fact that we can achieve better CPU thermals with liquid cooling in smaller cases, but I understand that most of you just prefer the simplicity of air cooling, and for that the i100 Pro is pretty damn effective. The sheer volume of air moving through this case is also demonstrated quite well with the superb motherboard VRM thermals. This isn't going to be a problem with even the warmest results in this chart with 60 or 70 degrees, but as always, cooler is better. As for GPU thermals, I tested the RTX 3080 Founders Edition where we get a pretty decent result. Thermals here are slightly better than the much more compact Ncase M1, and you could probably tie this with an NR200. Also, thermal performance does scale quite well with the speed that you're running the case fans at, which brings me to my next point, which is definitely to get your hands on some quiet fans if you're building in this case. I'd highly recommend the Noctua NFA 12x25, and if you prefer a black option, the Arctic P12s. I would also recommend the Tough Fan 12 from Thermaltake, depending on how offensive you find the identical Noctua design. So like I said in the intro, I would kind of consider this case as kind of like a larger NR200 with better build quality. With the larger volume, you of course do get more cooling, and especially more potential when it comes to custom loops. However, it is quite a bit more expensive, with pricing a little bit closer to an Ncase M1. So the tempered glass model is going to be on offer for $200 US, I'm told, and then $30 more expensive for the vented model, so $230. So $200 for the TG version, that's definitely on the pricier end of ITX cases, so you'd really have to love the big cooling support that you're getting here, and pairing this case with some really power-hungry components. Personally, I give this case a big thumbs up, and in particular, this air cooling configuration I think is really awesome. Super effective for those who don't want to deal with liquid cooling of any sort, although I am really interested in playing around with the custom loop in this case eventually. If you are interested in this case, definitely keep an eye out for it in the next 2 months, and if you are kind of building something a bit more urgent, I will leave some relevant ITX case reviews linked down below. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.